We want to turn our attention now to another top story from this week, and it's been a busy week inside that New York City courtroom. The former president on the stand in this civil fraud trial. His daughter, Ivanka Trump, there also taking the stand earlier on today. But now maybe the tides have turned a little bit as Trump's attorneys begin the defense in this civil fraud trial. We want to bring in right now former federal prosecutor Neama Rahmani. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And we're learning more information now about a directed verdict. That is what the Trump attorneys are trying to move forward with this, pressing for the judges. There's they say, no victim, no injury in this. This is new information that we're following here on Live Now from Fox. Maybe give me a breakdown of what a directed verdict potentially could be and how likely it is in this case.
Andy, this is really a Hail Mary type argument. There's no chance of success, but a directed verdict really asks the judge to rule in favor of one party because no reasonable finder of fact can rule otherwise. Usually it's a jury. Most of these cases are jury trials. Obviously, we know that this is a bench trial, but again, this is something that happens after either the prosecution or the plaintiff finishes their case in chief. The defense gets up there, says, "Judge, no juror, no finder of fact can rule in favor of the prosecution and the plaintiff, rule in our favor." I fully expect the judge to deny this motion.
And you mentioned it as a Hail Mary. And of course, maybe is this a signal that the Trump side feels that there's going to be a large sum that they're potentially on the line for, or is this just a legal protocol that is being followed by them?
This is typical. This is something that if you don't raise it, you lose it. But I fully believe that Trump's team thinks they're going to lose this case. So, even the way they're handling the legal strategy, they're looking for the court of appeal. That court has been more favorable to the defense than the judge in this case. And frankly, they're looking to the American people. A lot of what Trump has done in this case is talk to his base. It's been a great source of fundraising, but also talking to undecided voters, swing voters in 2024 that are going to decide who's going to be president next year.
Yeah, and we talked over the weekend about that being a big case. And of course, this from earlier in the week, the former president, before he goes in to the courtroom, he usually meets with the media, answers a few questions, or says his piece. Of course, in the middle of that testimony, he did give the zip the lip kind of motion as well. But then afterwards, of course, he unzipped those lips and made some remarks. He was in some maybe combative sparring moments between him and the judge earlier on this week. What do we make of those moments? And that can't help his case, right?
Certainly can. And we previewed it over the weekend and we thought that he would come out aggressive, but really it was guns blazing on Monday. I mean, he was going after the judge, much more combative and that I thought he would be. I mean, we know his MO over the years, but, I was really surprised at how aggressive he was and frankly, how soft the judge was. I'm thinking it was anyone else. If you or I were in that courtroom, we would have been held in contempt, thrown in jail, but Trump pushed the limits and frankly, the judge backed down. So very fascinating testimony for those of us that missed it on Monday.
Yeah, and the judge telling the lawyers for Trump, control your client or I will. And he said something about maybe inferencing the worst or the most negative portions of that. Do you think that will have a factor on the potential ruling, maybe the combative nature of their interactions there on the stand?
I think so. Judges are ordinary people, and he can't help but be affected by this. But, when the judge asked the defense team to control Trump, that's really the judge's job. Judges are supposed to control their courtroom and make sure it's not a circus. But really, it was a full-blown three-ring circus on Monday. So pretty disappointing. But I think ultimately, the judge thinks that we're going to head in the direction of a finding in favor of the state, a very significant judgment, if I had to guess, probably 9 figures, more than 100 million if I were a betting man. I think that's where we're headed in this case.
Yeah, potentially coming rather soon as well, because we're kind of wrapping this up. I do want to get into the other person that was on the stand testimony, his daughter, Ivanka Trump, no longer a defendant necessarily in this case because she's no longer really tied to their business dealings as well. She said, I do not recall quite a bit on the stand. Of course, Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, saying that she was kind, she was nice, but also the evidence potentially points to them being enriched by inflating these numbers. Was it kind of what we expected from Ivanka, following along the lines of her two brothers?
And it really was. And obviously, we've talked about Trump's MO over the years, a fighter, litigious. Ivanka has been a lot more calm, a lot more poised. And that's what we saw. I think the two real takeaways were obviously Donald Trump came out and tried to defend the valuations, but Ivanka took a page from her brother's script. She said, listen, this is not something I dealt with. This is something that the accountants handled. And she was even further removed from the Trump organization than Don Jr. and Eric. And, she hasn't been involved for many years. Her claims fall outside the statute of limitations. So she's not even a party. She's just a witness here. She tried to avoid testifying. Obviously, the judge in the Court of Appeals ruled that she had to show up. But I'd say what was interesting about Ivanka is she had a lot more I don't recalls, I don't remembers. Even when confronted with documents, with emails with her name on it, she said, listen, I don't remember. Now, a lot of this conduct was from 2011, some of it even earlier. So she even said famously, I was pregnant at the time, I don't remember. So I think that's something that maybe a juror that might resonate more, but really that she had so little exposure. I think she could get away with that given the amount of time that passed and frankly, the fact that she's no longer a party.
Yeah, that's a good point of this, that it's just the one individual, the judge, making this ruling, not necessarily a juror, and a juror might feel differently about that as well. I do want to get into maybe what comes next during this, because now the ball is really much in Trump's attorney's court. And we heard from Alina Habba, the attorney there for Trump, and she wouldn't give any hint or inkling of what's coming next in terms of maybe witnesses they bring forward. They're calling out Michael Cohen as maybe the star witness on the state side. Who potentially could be coming to the stand next? How will they defend this case from that side?
There's definitely a cat and mouse game going on here because the defense witness list has more than 100 people on it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the defense is going to call 100 people, but this is sort of where the legal strategy comes in. They probably throw all these witnesses on there to make it difficult for the state of New York to prepare the cross-examination of these witnesses. But really, they have to put up some sort of defense, and whether that's accountants, appraisers, CPAs, real estate lawyers, experts that are going to have to come in and really justify these valuations. That's what this case is about. You can blame the accountants all you want, but again, this isn't a criminal case. The organization is liable for, the acts of its employees. We've talked about that at length. So they're going to need someone, if they want to have any chance of winning this case, to get up there and testify about these properties and say that the valuations were not inflated and that they were reasonably accurate.
Yeah, and like you said, I remember over the weekend we were talking about how we potentially could see accountants, other people on the stand. And of course, there doesn't have to be necessarily a direct link because this is not a criminal trial. This is a civil trial. Just break that down one more time, even if maybe the accountants say, and I think it was either Don Jr. or Eric talking about how the accountants were doing their accounting. That necessarily maybe doesn't have a big swing compared to a criminal trial to a civil trial. Can you break that down for us?
Absolutely. There's a huge difference between a civil and a criminal case. So in a criminal case, generally, you have to show knowledge and intent. That's one. Generally, under criminal law, you're not liable for the acts or omissions of other people. It's your own personal liability. But, civil, all that goes out the window. So for instance, you are an employee of Fox. If you do something, the company is liable for your actions. You can be held responsible for mere negligence or sometimes even acts that aren't negligent at all. You don't have to have that knowledge and intent. So here the judge has already ruled that the financial statements were fraudulent. Now, there are some claims that require intent, such as conspiracy and so forth, but there's some civil claims that do not. So unless the defense can convince the judge to find in their favor that directed verdict, which is, again, very unlikely, they're going to have to show, regardless of whether they knew or not, that these valuations were accurate because the company is responsible for them. Now, the defense is arguing that the disclaimers were there, that there was no loss, and those are legal arguments, but those have already all been rejected by the judge. They've been litigated at length. So now it's time to really argue the case on the merits, put up your experts to justify these valuations. Otherwise, you're going to lose, and you're going to lose bad.
And that's a very good distinction there as we move toward a potential ruling coming forward. And of course, I have one more question for you, and I kind of skimmed over it in my notes here, but going back to Trump's testimony, when he was on the stand talking about potentially inflating some of those assets as well, he said something about how maybe he deflated some of the assets that he had that he thought they might be worth more. Maybe what do we make of that, and maybe how does that factor into this, where there's not necessarily the fact that it goes up or down, but that it's not necessarily accurate?
Yeah, so Trump's testimony was interesting. You know, he did admit that at least one of his properties in New York was inflated, or he thought was high, but really his testimony was the opposite, that most of the values he provided were low. They were conservative. Mar-a-Lago, of course, being the biggest one. I mean, he thinks it's worth between $1 and $1.5 billion. Again, you know, these are trophy properties, and Trump spends a lot of time talking about his brand, you know, his persona, and how it adds a lot of value. And that may be true. You know, it's not like we're buying, you know, property of just an ordinary Joe. This is something that belongs to a former president, maybe a current president, depending on how things go next year. So Trump spent a lot of time talking about his own valuation of the case. We'll see if it really moved the needle or convinced this judge.
All right. Neama Rahmani, thank you so much for breaking it all down. Some great perspective. Of course, it was some fireworks earlier this week. To be in that courtroom would have been something else. But thank you so much for your perspective here on Live Now.